The Ford F-250 had a scratch along the passenger door that Jack Merritt had always meant to fix. He never did. For 11 years, that truck sat in the driveway of a house he no longer owned, absorbing West Virginia winters and summer dust, and the particular silence that comes after a life has been taken apart piece by piece. He had driven that truck to job sites before dawn, when the company still had job sites. He had driven his son Danny to baseball practice in it, back when Danny still wanted to be driven anywhere by his father. He had loaded it with boxes the morning his wife Claire told him she was done, and he had driven those boxes to a storage unit off Route 60 and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes without going inside. Now the truck was being sold to a 23-year-old in a clean white t-shirt who counted out the cash without looking up. Jack stood on the cracked pavement of a trailer park outside Charleston and watched the F-250 pull away. The young man did not wave. Jack did not expect him to. He stood there until the truck turned the corner and disappeared behind a row of storage units, and then he stood there a little longer, because there was nowhere particular to be. He was 58 years old. He had spent 28 of those years building things. Bridges, industrial foundations, a company from nothing. He knew load-bearing calculations and soil composition and the precise angle at which stress fractures begin. He had employed 14 people at the peak. He had been the kind of man other men called when something needed to be done right. The recession of 2008 had not cared about any of that. Neither had his business partner of 9 years, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had quietly moved company assets into a separate LLC for 18 months before the firm collapsed. By the time Jack understood what had happened, there was nothing left to save, and nothing legally simple enough to fight. The lawyers cost more than the recovery. The house followed the company. The marriage, which had been struggling long before the money disappeared, did not survive the version of Jack that emerged from those years. Quieter, harder to reach, carrying something he could not name and could not set down. Danny had been 17 when it all fell apart, old enough to understand, young enough that it shaped the way he looked at his father from that point forward. Not with anger exactly, something closer to disappointment, which is worse, because anger can be argued with. Now Danny was 26 and lived in Pittsburgh and called on birthdays with the careful politeness of a man fulfilling an obligation. Jack did not blame him. He had not been easy to love during those years. He was not sure he was easy to love now. The trailer he rented was small and clean. He kept it clean because that was the kind of man he was. There was a kitchen table, a coffee maker, a shelf of engineering manuals he had not opened in years but could not bring himself to throw away. There was a single window above the kitchen sink that looked out on the parking area and the row of identical trailers across the narrow lane. In the mornings, the light came through that window at an angle that was almost beautiful for about 10 minutes before the day settled into ordinary gray. Jack had learned to be awake for those 10 minutes. It was a small thing, but small things were what he had. Outside, the trailer park spread in 2 rows of identical units, neighbors he nodded to but did not know. He had lived there 14 months. He had stopped counting after 12. There was a woman 3 trailers down who kept a garden she worked every evening after she got home from whatever job she worked, kneeling in the dirt with the focused attention of someone doing something that mattered to her. Jack watched her sometimes from his window. He never introduced himself. He told himself it was because he respected her privacy. The truth was simpler and harder to say. That evening, he made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the $3,200 in cash from the truck sale sitting in an envelope. It was the largest amount of money he had held in a single place in 4 years. He should have felt something about that. He did not. He thought about what it represented, not as money, but as the last physical object in his possession that connected him to the man he used to be. That version of Jack had owned tools and land and a business with his name on the door and a son who looked at him like he had things figured out. That version felt like a story about someone else now. A story he could recall in outline, but not in feeling. His phone rang at 8:47 in the evening. The number was local, but not one he recognized. He almost did not answer. The voice was old. Not weak, just worn, the way wood gets worn when it has been handled for a long time. It belonged to a man who introduced himself as Gerald Foss, attorney at law, retired. He said he had been trying to locate Jack Merritt for several months. He said the matter was urgent and personal and could not be discussed over the phone. His voice had the measured quality of a man who had learned to say important things carefully, to give them the weight they deserved without tipping into drama. Jack asked what it concerned. The old man paused, a long pause, the kind that comes when someone is deciding how much to say in a moment that cannot be taken back. Then he said the name Walter Merritt, and he said there was something that had been waiting for Jack for a very long time, something that required him to come in person, and that time was now a factor in a way it had not been before. Jack said nothing for a moment. Walter Merritt had died in 1987, 4 years before Jack finished college. He remembered a quiet man with large hands who smelled of pipe tobacco and said little but watched everything. He remembered Walter at Christmas, sitting apart from the rest of the family, drinking coffee and looking out whatever window was nearest with an expression that was not sadness exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had made its peace with a certain kind of loss. He remembered asking his father once why Grandpa Walter was always sad. His father had said Walter was not sad, he was just Walter. It had not been a satisfying answer even then. In retrospect, it felt like a door that had been shut before Jack was old enough to push it open. The family did not talk much about Walter. After he died, even less. Jack's father had described him as a difficult man, a proud man, someone who had made choices that cost the family opportunities they might otherwise have had. The specifics were always vague, in the way that family secrets are vague, not hidden exactly, but never illuminated, like furniture in a room where nobody turns the lights on. Children were not told the details. Then the children became adults, and the details had sunk too deep to retrieve without an effort nobody wanted to make. Jack agreed to meet. Gerald Foss lived in a row house in the South Hills neighborhood of Charleston, the kind of street where every yard had a flag and every driveway had a car that was 10 years old but well maintained. The houses were modest and the trees were old, and the neighborhood had the quality of a place that had not changed much in 40 years. Gerald opened the door himself and led Jack to a small sitting room crowded with books and legal files and the particular smell of a house where a man had been living alone for a long time and had made a separate peace with that. He moved carefully, like a man managing pain he had decided not to mention. He was 78 years old, and his skin had the translucent quality of someone whose body had already begun the long process of letting go. He poured coffee without asking, and sat across from Jack, and placed a manila envelope on the table between them. "I need to tell you something before you open that," he said. "I have stage 4 lung cancer. My doctors give me 6 to 8 weeks, which means I have perhaps 4 to 6 weeks of real clarity before the medication makes it difficult to be precise. I am telling you this not for sympathy, but because you need to understand why I'm coming to you now after all this time. Walter Merritt entrusted me with this material in 1987, the week before he died. He made me promise to hold it until the right person was ready to receive it. He was very specific about what that meant. Jack asked what it meant. Gerald looked at him steadily, the look of a man who had been waiting a long time to deliver something and was making sure, in these final moments before he did, that the recipient was who he needed them to be. He said the man who gets this should be a Merritt by blood, old enough to understand what men do to each other, and hungry enough not to walk away. He said I would know who it was when I met him, because he would be a man who had already lost everything and had not yet decided what that meant. Jack sat with that for a long moment. The coffee was hot and bitter and good. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street. The room was very quiet. He opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of a last will and testament, notarized and dated 1987, bearing his grandfather's signature in a careful cursive hand that Jack found himself studying longer than was strictly necessary, as if the shape of the letters could tell him something about the man who had formed them. The will identified a property in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, a cabin and the surrounding land, and named Jack Merritt as sole heir. There were survey coordinates, an old deed reference number, and a handwritten note on a separate page that said only, "The cabin has been sealed. The seal is no longer valid. Go before they file to renew it." Jack read the last line twice. What does that mean, the seal? Gerald folded his hands. The cabin was closed in 1952 by order of the United States Department of the Interior. The stated reason was protection of mineral resources in the national interest. The actual reason, as I have come to understand it over 40 years of holding this file, was to make certain Walter Merritt could never return to it and retrieve what he left inside. Jack looked up from the papers. Something in his chest had shifted, some internal weight redistributing itself. The closure order had a sunset provision, Gerald continued, 70 years, standard language in certain post-war federal orders. The order expired last year. Caldwell Energy, which is the successor company to Caldwell Mining, filed a petition to renew the closure in February. The petition is still pending. There is a window, possibly a narrow one, during which you have the legal right, as the documented heir, to access that property. After the renewal is granted, that window closes. Who is Caldwell Energy? Gerald studied him. You have never heard the name. Should I have? They are the largest private employer in 4 West Virginia counties. They have a building in Charleston with their name on it in letters 4 feet tall. Preston Caldwell III is currently on the Governor's Economic Advisory Council. He paused in the way people pause when the next sentence is the one that matters. His grandfather was Harrison Caldwell, and Harrison Caldwell is why your grandfather lost everything he had built, and why your family has spent the last 70 years living smaller than they should have. Gerald Foss died 11 days later. Jack would learn this afterward from a short obituary in the Charleston Gazette. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. Gerald had told Jack it would be cancer, lung cancer specifically, and that he had weeks remaining. Jack had no way of knowing whether that discrepancy meant anything at all. He was not, by nature, a man who saw patterns in coincidences, but he filed the information in the part of his mind where things that do not fit go to wait. And he did not forget it. The drive to Pocahontas County took 3 hours through mountain roads that narrowed as the elevation climbed. Jack drove a rental, a small sedan that felt wrong after years of the truck, too low and too quiet. He stopped at the county seat, a town called Marlinton, and found the public library which also housed the county historical archives in two back rooms that smelled of old paper and dry cold. The woman at the desk had the careful neutrality of a librarian who had seen many things people did not expect to find in a public library. She was skeptical of his request until he showed her the deed reference number from the will. She disappeared into a back room and returned with a box of microfilm. What he found in those records rearranged something in his understanding of his own family. Not loudly, quietly, the way a foundation shifts before the structure above it begins to show the strain. Walter Merritt had owned 1,400 acres in the Blackwater Valley section of Pocahontas County. The land had been in the Merritt family since the 1890s, homesteaded by Jack's great-great-grandfather in the years after the Civil War, when the government was distributing parcels to veterans willing to farm the mountain valleys. Walter had inherited it in 1938, and by 1947 had conducted independent geological surveys of the property, filed with the State Mining Commission under his professional license number. Jack stared at that phrase, professional license number. He asked the librarian to pull the licensing records. She brought him another box. Inside, a 1946 document from the West Virginia Department of Mines listed Walter Merritt as a licensed mine engineer, certification class 1, the highest available at the time. Not a laborer, not a foreman, a credentialed professional engineer. The same profession Jack had spent his adult life practicing, the same discipline, the same fundamental way of seeing the physical world as a system of forces and structures and the relationships between them. And nobody in his family had ever said one word about it. He sat back in the library chair. The fluorescent light hummed above him. He was barely aware of it. His grandfather had been an engineer. The old man sitting apart at Christmas, looking out the window, had been a man with a professional education and a trained mind and knowledge that had been buried along with everything else that bore his name. The family's silence about Walter was not the silence of a difficult man better forgotten. It was the silence of a wound that had never closed because the people who carried it had never understood what had made it. Jack paid for copies of the key documents and drove deeper into the mountains. The road to the cabin was not on any map his phone could find. He followed the hand-drawn directions from the envelope, faded but legible, annotated in the same economical notation he now recognized as Walter's. 3 miles past the Greenbrier River Bridge at County Route 21, left at the stand of White Birch, half a mile on the gravel track. The gravel track was now mostly moss and compressed earth, 2 shallow ruts through the undergrowth that suggested it had once been used with regularity and then abandoned with equal deliberateness. The trees on either side were old growth, thick enough that the light came through them, filtered and green, and the air had dropped 20 degrees from the temperature in Marlinton. He drove until the ruts ended and walked the rest of the way. A hawk moved in a long, slow arc above the ridgeline. The mountain had a sound that was not silence, but the texture of something that had been undisturbed long enough to develop its own character. The cabin appeared between the trees without announcement, the way things appear when you have been walking long enough that you stop expecting them. Jack stopped and stood still. It was built on a rise, which he had not anticipated. The slope behind it continued upward another 100 feet before leveling into a ridge, and from the ridge, he understood, immediately you could see the entire Blackwater Valley laid out below. Walter had not built his cabin in a hollow for shelter from weather. He had built it on a rise for the view, an engineer's choice. Put yourself where you can see the full geometry of the problem. The structure was sound, or appeared to be. Log construction, dovetail corners, the work of a man who knew what he was doing and did not look for shortcuts. The roof was old, but had not collapsed. The windows were boarded from the outside, the boards darkened by decades of weather, but still holding in their frames. And across the door, fastened with 4 bolts to the frame on either side, hung a metal plate stamped with a federal seal and the words, "Property closed by order of the Department of the Interior, 1952. No entry authorized." The metal was pitted with rust. The bolts had not been turned in 7 decades. Jack stood in front of the door for a while. He was aware of the silence, not the absent silence of a city at 4 in the morning, but the present silence of a mountain wilderness filled with the sound of wind in high timber and the creek in the hollow below, and something moving in the brush 50 yards to his left that was certainly an animal and probably harmless. He was aware of the light dropping in the west, still hours from dark, but moving in that direction with the indifference that light has toward whatever is happening below it. He thought about the 23-year-old driving his truck somewhere right now, the scratch on the passenger door that he had never fixed. He thought about Gerald Foss, pouring coffee with hands that shook slightly, a man who had carried someone else's secret for 40 years and was trying, with the specific urgency of a man running out of time, to put it in hands that could do something with it. He thought about his grandfather sitting apart at Christmas, watching windows, holding something inside that he could not share and would not surrender. He took the wrench from his jacket pocket and put it to the first bolt. The rust had fused the threads, and the first bolt took real effort, the kind that reminded him he was 58 and not 38. The second was easier once he understood the angle. The third and fourth came free faster. The metal plate came away from the door frame with a sound that was not loud but carried, a release of pressure that had been building for 70 years. Jack held the plate in his hands. He felt its surprising lightness, this thing that had carried so much symbolic mass. He set it against the cabin wall with a care he could not entirely explain, the care of a man who understands that even the instruments of injustice deserve to be set down gently, because they are also instruments of history. The key was in the envelope. He had not been certain it would still work. It turned in the lock with resistance and then with sudden cooperation, the mechanism clicking over with the solidity of something built by a man who built things to last. The door swung inward on hinges that protested briefly and then moved freely, as if they had been waiting for exactly this. The air that came out was cold and still and carried the smell of stopped time. Not decay. More like the smell of a place held at a specific moment for so long that the moment itself had become a kind of atmosphere. He stepped inside. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping area partitioned at the far end. A solid oak table occupied the center, handmade, with 2 chairs pushed in neatly, the chairs of a man who was orderly even when leaving under pressure, who could not walk out of a room without putting things back in their proper position. On the table, a coffee mug, a folded newspaper dated October 1952, a pair of reading glasses with one lens slightly scratched, a wool work coat hung on a hook beside the door. The fireplace held cold ashes that still held the ghost shape of what had burned there last. Jack moved through the space slowly, not touching anything yet. The floors were solid underfoot. The walls smelled of pine and old paper, and underneath everything else, the ghost of pipe tobacco, which hit him in the chest without warning. Walter. Christmas. The window. On the wall hung a topographic map of Pocahontas County, hand-annotated in the economical notation he now recognized as Walter's professional hand. Survey markers in blue ink, elevation lines in black, and in the valley section below the cabin's position, a series of notations in red pencil that Jack recognized without effort because he had been making the same kind of annotations his entire professional life. Core sample locations, depth markers, stratum identifications. Walter had been mapping the subsurface geology of his own land with the rigor of someone who intended the map to serve as evidence in a legal proceeding. There was a bookshelf beside the fireplace, engineering manuals from the 1940s, land law references, a worn Bible, several volumes on West Virginia history, and a row of composition notebooks arranged by date, the earliest marked 1946. Beside them, slightly apart, placed last and deliberately, a single journal with a well-worn cover. Jack went first to the sleeping area. There was a main bed made with military precision, the blanket tucked at the corners in the specific way men of a certain generation and experience learned and never abandoned. But behind a secondary partition he had not noticed from the doorway was a smaller space, a child's sleeping area, a wooden bed with a white-painted headboard faded now to old cream. At the foot of the bed, folded with care, a small quilt in blue and green squares. On the nightstand, a tin soldier and a folded piece of paper. Jack picked up the paper, a child's drawing, in heavy pencil. Two figures in front of this cabin, one tall and one small. Below them, in the large, careful letters of a child proud of a new skill, me and Grandpa. He stood there with the drawing in his hands longer than he was aware of. He had not known there were children in this cabin. He had not known any of this, and the not knowing settled on him with a weight he had not been ready for, the weight of understanding that a family had kept a secret, not out of shame, but out of fear, and that the fear had been large enough to hollow out the space where certain truths should have lived. He set the drawing back carefully and returned to the main room and picked up the journal. The handwriting inside was dense and precise, the penmanship of a man who had been taught to mean what he put on paper. The entries began in September 1948, and Jack read them with the attention he gave to engineering reports, tracking what was established fact and what was inference and what was the professional judgment of someone who had worked a problem from every angle. Walter wrote about the land the way a man writes about something he loves and is afraid of losing. He documented the survey work in technical language that Jack followed without effort. Engineer to engineer across 70 years. The numbers Walter had arrived at for the coal deposit beneath the Blackwater Valley were extraordinary. The seam depth, the estimated volume, the quality grade. In conservative professional estimates, the deposit was worth more than Jack could quickly calculate. Then, Harrison Caldwell had appeared. Walter described the first meeting with the restraint of a man who distrusted his own anger and had learned to give it distance before committing it to paper. Caldwell came with 2 lawyers and a proposed joint development agreement. Walter would retain surface ownership. Caldwell Mining would extract the coal under a revenue-sharing arrangement. The terms seemed reasonable, Walter wrote, until I read them with the care they deserved. The agreement was 42 pages. On page 37, in language that required a lawyer to pass and perhaps a second lawyer to confirm, was a clause that transferred mineral rights in perpetuity to Caldwell Mining upon the commencement of any extraction activity. Commencement was defined in a subsection as the moment any extraction equipment made first contact with the soil. After that point, Walter's surface ownership was legally meaningless. The coal would belong to Caldwell. Walter did not sign. Caldwell returned with a revised offer that was cosmetically different and substantively identical. Walter did not sign that one either. He documented both refusals in the journal with the flat precision of a man who understood that the record of a refusal is as important as the refusal itself. The third visit, Walter wrote, they did not bring lawyers. They brought a different kind of persuasion. The entry was 3 sentences. Jack read each of them 3 times. Walter did not describe what was said. He wrote only that he understood now that this was not a negotiation, and that his sister Carol's name had come up in a context that made his blood run cold. Jack set the journal down and looked at the topographic map on the wall. He looked at the red pencil notations in the valley below, the precise record of what the ground held and what it was worth. He thought about what it meant to build something with your mind and your inherited land and your professional training, and then to have it taken not by force, but by paperwork and leverage, and the patient application of power by men who understood that most men will eventually choose their family's safety over their own principles. But Walter had not signed. Jack turned to the final entries. The handwriting had changed, still precise, the discipline of the man still visible, but faster. The pen pressed harder against the page. He wrote about Caldwell's representative, referred to as H, coming to the cabin uninvited in the second week of October 1952, about an argument that escalated in a way Walter had not expected, about his certainty that the evidence he had gathered was legally sufficient to prove fraud, but that using it required time and safety and institutional support he was not certain he could access in Pocahontas County in 1952, where the institutional relationships ran in directions that did not favor a man without political connections fighting a family that had them in abundance. And he wrote about Carol, his sister. He wrote about her in the terse, controlled sentences of a man frightened in a way he could not fully admit. He was not afraid for himself. He was afraid for her. The last entry was dated October 19th, 1952. They came back this evening. 2 of them this time. And the man from the county office who has been in Caldwell's pocket since before the war. I have made arrangements. I have put everything where it needs to be found by the right person at the right time. If the name Walter Merritt means anything after I am gone, it will be because someone found what I left here and had the stomach and the patience to use it properly. I do not need vindication. The land is not the point. It was never about the land. 11 men. That is the point. Someone has to say their names out loud in a room where it costs something to say them. Jack closed the journal. He sat in his grandfather's chair in his grandfather's cabin and looked at his grandfather's map on the wall. 11 men. He did not yet know what that referred to, but Walter had written it with the gravity of a man for whom those 2 words represented the full weight of everything he had done and refused to do and lost in the process. Not the land, not the money, 11 men. Jack stood and walked to the fireplace. The stones were old, mortared carefully, but one stone near the base of the firebox was slightly larger than the others and did not match the surrounding stonework in color or texture. Set later, by someone who knew the original structure well enough to approximate it, but could not quite match the color of stone quarried from a different location at a different time. An engineer noticed these things. It was the kind of discrepancy that was invisible to most eyes and obvious to the trained ones. Jack knelt on the cold floor and pressed the stone with both hands. It shifted. He pressed harder. The mortar around it was dry and loose, and the stone rotated around a point near its center. Behind it was a cavity cut into the fireplace foundation with deliberate precision, the edges clean and squared, the work of a man with tools and a specific purpose. Inside wrapped in oilcloth, tied with waxed cord, was a bundle of documents that the darkness and the dry mountain air had preserved across 7 decades. Jack carried them to the table and untied the cord with careful hands. Land deeds, original and signed, covering 1,400 acres. Survey records in Walter's hand, each page signed and dated and annotated with professional specificity. A hand-drawn geological cross-section of the valley subsurface, Walter's engineering license number stamped in the corner, dated 1947. The work of years, the work of a mind that had been rigorous and thorough and building a case long before the case became necessary. And beneath all of these, a document different from the others in weight and in the formal quality of its paper. A contract. 42 pages. Jack turned to the signature page. The line for Harrison Caldwell's signature, signed, witnessed, notarized. The line for Walter Merritt's signature, blank. Completely, absolutely blank. Jack stared at that page for a long time. The contract had been executed by Caldwell's side. It had not been executed by Walter, which meant that if this agreement had been filed anywhere, if any transfer of rights had been recorded under its authority, then Walter's signature had been forged. And if it had been forged, then everything that followed from it, every dollar extracted from the Blackwater Valley, every permit issued and every ton shipped and every quarterly report filed with investors, all of it rested on a signature that a man had refused to give, forged in his name after he refused. Jack heard the sound of tires on gravel outside. He moved to the window and looked through the gap in the boards. A black SUV had stopped at the point where the gravel track ended and the footpath to the cabin began. The engine was still running. The late afternoon light caught the windshield at an angle that made the interior invisible. The vehicle sat without moving. Jack did not move either. He counted 4 full minutes. Then the SUV reversed slowly, deliberately, back the way it had come, and the sound of it faded into the sound of the mountain and was gone. He turned back to the table, and the documents spread across it. Outside, through the boards over the windows, the light was failing in earnest now. The valley below was dropping into shadow, and far down in that shadow, just visible at this distance, were the lights of industrial buildings. The Caldwell Energy Processing Facility, running at full capacity, on land whose legal transfer rested on a signature that Walter Merritt had refused to give. Jack sat down again in Walter's chair. He picked up the journal and turned to the first page and started from the beginning. He had read it once to understand the outline. He needed to read it again to understand the structure beneath the outline, the load paths, the points where the argument was strongest and where it would need support. He read until the light through the window boards was entirely gone and the cabin was dark except for the low burn of a kerosene lantern he had found on the shelf and lit with matches from his pocket. He read until the lamp oil dropped and the flame began to waver. Then he turned the wick down and sat in the near dark and listened to the mountain, which had its own conversation with the night, wind in high timber and the creek in the hollow below the ridge, and something moving through the brush with the unhurried confidence of something that lived here and knew it. He was 58 years old. He was sitting in a cabin sealed since 1952, holding documents that a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars had filed a federal petition to keep buried. A man he had not known well enough to grieve properly had died 11 days ago under circumstances that did not match what he had been told to expect. A black SUV had parked at the end of the gravel track and watched the cabin for 4 minutes and left without approaching. He had nowhere to be. He had nothing waiting for him in Charleston except an envelope of cash and a clean trailer. For the first time in years, that did not feel like the definition of nothing. It felt like the definition of available. Walter Merritt had been an engineer. He had mapped the ground beneath his own feet with professional rigor and the deep conviction of a man who understands that what is true does not stop being true because powerful people prefer otherwise. He had been defrauded by men with more lawyers and more patience, and he had refused to make it easy for them, and it had cost him everything he could name. But he had sealed this cabin, and he had hidden what he knew, and he had written it all down with an engineer's precision and left it for the right hands at the right time. Jack thought about 11 men whose names he did not yet know. He thought about a sister named Carol, who the family said had died in 1955, and about whom Walter had been frightened in ways he would not put fully on paper. He thought about Gerald Foss and a cardiac arrest that came ahead of schedule. He thought about a black SUV and 4 minutes and the quality of a retreat that knows it will return. Then he stopped thinking about all of it and simply sat in the dark, with his grandfather's journal in his hands and the blank signature line on the Caldwell contract, visible on the table in the last thin light from the dying lamp. He felt something settle in his chest that had not settled in years. Not peace, something more active than peace. The feeling a man gets when he has finally found the load-bearing problem in a structure that has been failing for a long time, and understands for the first time what it would actually take to fix it. He was not leaving. Whatever had been waiting in this cabin for 70 years had been waiting for a man who had lost enough to have nothing left to protect. A man who could read what Walter had written in both languages, the language of loss and the language of engineering. A man who had the specific freedom that comes only when there is nothing left to be careful about. The lantern flame went out. Jack sat in the complete dark of a mountain night, in a chair his grandfather had built, in a cabin his grandfather had made, and did not move. He had arrived as a man with nothing. He was beginning to understand that nothing and everything are sometimes the same thing, depending entirely on where you decide to stand. Jack did not sleep well. He slept in Walter's chair, with his jacket pulled across his shoulders, and the journal on the table in front of him, and the documents in his bag on the floor beside his feet, because he was not going to leave them anywhere he could not feel them. The mountain cold came through the log walls in the early hours, not severely but persistently, the kind of cold that does not attack but simply waits. And he woke twice in the dark to the sound of wind shifting through the ridge timber above the cabin, and lay still listening until he was certain it was only wind. He was awake before dawn. He sat in the gray pre-light and looked at the cabin taking shape around him as the darkness softened. The table, the coat on the hook, the map on the wall, with Walter's red pencil marks in the valley. The fireplace with its cold ashes. He had been in this space less than 24 hours, and it already felt less like a discovery and more like a return, the particular feeling of a place that has been waiting for you specifically, that has your dimensions built into it without either of you knowing. He made no fire. He ate a granola bar from his jacket pocket and drank water from the bottle he had carried in, and watched the light come up through the gaps in the window boards, the thin gold lines of it moving slowly across the floor like something measuring the room. He heard the vehicle at 7:12 in the morning. Not a vehicle approaching on the gravel track. A vehicle already stopped somewhere below the rise, its engine idling with the particular patience of someone who has been there for a while and intends to be there longer. Jack stood and moved to the window and looked through the gap in the boards and saw a Pocahontas County Sheriff's vehicle parked at the edge of the cleared ground below the cabin. Engine running, no lights. One person inside. not moving. Jack put on his jacket and walked outside. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of clarity that comes after a night of no wind, and the valley below the ridge was visible in extraordinary detail. The tree lines and the river bend, and the Caldwell Energy Facility, sitting in its cleared acreage with its corrugated metal roofs, catching the early light. From up here, the scale of the operation was visible in a way that it would not be from the valley floor. It was large. It had been large for a long time. The man who stepped out of the sheriff's vehicle was in his late 50s, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had spent decades in weather and had the particular set of a man who had learned to make his expressions neutral as a professional habit. He wore his uniform correctly. He moved without urgency. He was not a man who needed to perform authority because he had been exercising it long enough that it simply resided in him. He introduced himself as Miles Pruitt, Sheriff of Pocahontas County, 22 years in the position. He said it with the flatness of a man stating a fact rather than establishing a credential. He looked at the open door of the cabin, at the metal seal plate leaning against the wall beside it, and he looked at Jack with an expression that communicated something that was not quite surprise and not quite its opposite. "You'd be the Merritt heir," he said. Jack said he was. "Someone reported the seal was removed." Pruitt's voice was even. "I need to see your documentation." Jack brought out the will and the notarized authorization and the deed reference, and let Pruitt examine them without comment. The sheriff read each document with the careful attention of a man who was actually reading rather than performing the act of reading. He took his time. Jack waited. The morning light was moving across the clearing. Pruitt handed the documents back. "Everything looks to be in order." He paused in the way that experienced men pause when the thing they are about to say is the thing that actually matters. "This is Deep County, Mr. Merritt. Cell service is unreliable. These roads close fast in bad weather." He looked at the cabin, then back at Jack. "These mountains can be unpredictable for people who don't know them." Jack looked at him directly. "I appreciate the concern." The two men stood in the cold morning air and understood each other completely without either of them saying what they understood. Then Pruitt nodded once, got back in the vehicle, and drove back down the gravel track. Jack stood and watched until the vehicle was out of sight. Then he went back inside and sat down and looked at the documents on the table and understood that the window of time he was operating in had just become significantly smaller. Whoever had called the sheriff's office to report the seal removal had done so with the specific purpose of establishing that someone official had paid a visit. Not to remove Jack, to remind him that they knew where he was. He spent the next 2 hours doing what he had been trained to do. He worked the problem like an engineering project. He laid the documents out on the table in the order in which they would matter to a legal argument. The original land deeds establishing Walter's ownership, the geological survey records establishing Walter's professional expertise and the basis for his claim, the unsigned contract establishing that the transfer of mineral rights had never been legally completed, and the journal, which was not a legal document, but was the kind of human record that, in the right hands, could make a jury understand what had happened to a man and his family across 70 years. He went through Walter's survey records in detail. The man's methodology was rigorous. He had not simply estimated the coal deposit from surface indicators. He had drilled core samples at 12 locations across the property and documented each one with the precision of a professional who understood that the value of data lies in its verifiability. The cross-section drawing on the wall of the cabin was not a sketch. It was a technical document that would hold up in any proceeding where geological expertise was at issue. Then Jack turned to the Caldwell contract and read all 42 pages. He read them slowly, the way he had always read contracts and specifications, looking not for what was said, but for what was structured by what was said. The language was sophisticated for 1951. Someone had put real legal intelligence into this document. Not county-level intelligence, but the kind of intelligence you bought from firms in Charleston or Pittsburgh or further east. The mineral rights transfer mechanism on page 37 was elegant, in the way that certain traps are elegant, concealed inside reasonable language, requiring multiple readings and a specific kind of attention to isolate. An ordinary man signing that contract would not have understood what he was signing away until the extraction equipment broke ground and the clause activated. Walter had understood, and Walter had refused. Jack thought about that for a moment. The discipline it took to read 42 pages with sufficient care in 1951, without legal training, to isolate a clause on page 37 that any reasonable person would have missed. Walter had done that. He had read the document the way an engineer reads a specification, looking for what fails rather than what works, looking for the load the structure could not bear. He needed to find someone who could use what he was holding, someone who spoke the language of these institutions from the inside. He put everything back in his bag and sat for a moment in the quiet of the cabin. Then he took out his phone. 1 bar of signal, barely enough. He typed a text to Danny in Pittsburgh and sat watching the screen until the indicator showed it had sent. He wrote, "I need to talk. Call when you can. It is about our family. It matters." Then he put the phone away and picked up the 1946 composition notebook from the shelf and started reading Walter's earliest record keeping, before any of this had started, before Harrison Caldwell had appeared with his lawyers and his 42 pages. Walter, in 1946, had been a man in his early 40s, a widower raising 2 children alone on family land in the mountains, working as a consulting engineer on mining projects across 3 counties while conducting his own surveys of the Blackwater Valley property in what he described as the morning hours before the workday began. He wrote about the land with an affection that was technical and personal simultaneously, the affection of a man who loved something and also understood it in professional terms. He described the soil composition and the drainage patterns and the way the ridge blocked the north wind in winter and the way the creek ran clear in August when the water table was lowest and what that told you about the aquifer beneath. He wrote about teaching his children to read the landscape. His son Robert, who was Jack's father, was mentioned as a boy who preferred books to the outdoors, which Walter recorded without judgment. His daughter Carol, 11 years younger than Robert, was mentioned as someone who understood the land the way Walter did, who could look at a hillside and tell you where the spring was and which way the water ran underground. Walter wrote about Carol with a quality of pride that was different from how he wrote about anything else. Not the pride of a man whose child is exceptional, though that was present. The pride of a man who has found unexpectedly someone who sees the world the way he does. Jack read those passages twice. Carol had been the one who understood what Walter understood. Carol had been the one Walter was afraid for in October of 1952. Carol had supposedly died in an automobile accident in 1955, 3 years after the cabin was sealed, and the family had never talked about her, and Jack had grown up not knowing she existed as more than a vague reference, a name his father had never explained and never offered to explain. He was beginning to think Carol was the next thing he needed to find, not a grave, a person. The knock at the door came at 11:47 in the morning, precisely and deliberately 3 measured knocks with an interval between each one that communicated purpose rather than impatience. Jack stood and crossed to the door. The woman on the porch was 70 years old and did not look at the way some people do not look their age because they have been fortunate. She looked 70 the way certain materials look their age, honestly, with the evidence of use visible in her face and hands, and the way she stood, slightly forward, the posture of someone who has spent a professional lifetime leaning toward problems. She was dressed in clothes that were good quality and slightly worn, the clothes of a person who had earned money and then at some point stopped caring what spending it signaled. She introduced herself as Vera Oakes, attorney, retired. She said she had driven from Charleston that morning and she would like to come in, because what she had to say was better said sitting down. Jack stepped aside. She looked at the cabin interior without visible surprise, the way a person looks at something they have thought about for a long time and are now simply confirming. She sat in the chair across from Jack's and placed a leather satchel on the table between them and folded her hands on top of it. "I worked for Caldwell Energy for 30 years, she said, general counsel from 1998 to 2019. Before that, I was a junior partner at the firm that did their outside legal work going back to the 1970s. I know where every document in their history lives. I know how the company was structured and why and what they were protecting when they structured it that way." She looked at him steadily. "I also know what your grandfather found in the Blackwater Valley and why they could not let him keep it." Jack said nothing. He waited. "Gerald Foss called me 6 weeks ago," Vera said. "He told me he had finally found the right heir and that things were going to move quickly after that. Gerald was careful and methodical, and he did not use the word quickly lightly." She paused. "He died 4 days later." The obituary said cardiac arrest. "Gerald ran 3 miles every morning and had the blood pressure of a man 15 years younger. I know because we had lunch monthly for 20 years. She looked at him steadily. "I am not telling you what that means. I am telling you what I know." Jack looked at her for a moment, then he reached into his bag and placed the unsigned Caldwell contract on the table. Vera looked at it without touching it. Something moved in her expression that was not surprise, but was adjacent to recognition. The expression of a person seeing confirmation of something they had long suspected. She reached into her satchel and placed her own document on the table beside it. It was a photocopy, a contract visually identical to the one Walter had hidden in the fireplace. 42 pages, same formatting, same language, same clause on page 37. Jack turned to the signature page. Walter Merritt's name was there, with a signature above it. He looked at the 2 pages side by side, the original blank and the filed copy signed, and the difference between them was the entire story of what had been done to his grandfather and to the land beneath the Blackwater Valley, and to 11 men whose names he still did not know. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "Caldwell's own records," Vera said. "I spent 30 years in that building. In the final years I was there, I spent a significant portion of my time copying documents I had no legal right to copy and storing them somewhere with no connection to Caldwell or anyone associated with them." She said it without apology, the way you state a decision you made deliberately and have not reconsidered. "I did not leave that company because I developed a conscience late in life. I developed a conscience on day 1 and spent 30 years building a case file while appearing otherwise. That is a different thing, and it matters to what I am about to show you." She opened the satchel. What she placed on the table over the next 10 minutes rearranged the structure of what Jack had understood he was dealing with. He had come to Pocahontas County thinking he was dealing with a land dispute, a forgery, a 70-year-old fraud that had robbed his grandfather of property worth a significant amount of money. That was true, but it was the smaller truth. The larger truth was in Vera's files. March 14th, 1953. A collapse at Caldwell Mining's Blackwater No. 3 shaft, located on what had been Walter Merritt's property. 11 men had gone into the shaft at the 6 in the morning shift change and had not come out. The official report filed with the West Virginia Department of Mines attributed the collapse to unexpected geological instability in the stratum above the main seam. Natural causes. An unforeseeable event. Vera placed a second document beside the official report. It was an internal memorandum on Caldwell Mining Company letterhead, dated January 28, 1953, 7 weeks before the collapse. It was addressed to Harrison Caldwell personally from the company's chief mining engineer, a man named Robert Alcott. The memorandum described, in technical language, that Jack followed without difficulty the condition of the support structure in the Blackwater No. 3 shaft. The primary cross members in the upper drift section were failing. The rate of deterioration suggested that without replacement, structural compromise was probable within 60 to 90 days. Alcott recommended immediate suspension of operations and emergency repair. The memorandum had been stamped, reviewed in red ink. Below the stamp, in handwriting that Vera identified as Harrison Caldwell's own, were 2 words: continue operations. Jack read those 2 words 3 times. Then Vera placed a third document on the table. This one was a letter dated February 3, 1953, 5 days after Alcott's memorandum. It was addressed to Harrison Caldwell from Walter Merritt. Walter had obtained or inferred information about the shaft's condition, and he wrote about it in the precise language of a mine engineer describing a structural integrity problem. He had inspected the surface subsidence patterns above the number 3 shaft, and they were consistent with progressive failure of primary support members in the upper drift. He wrote that in his professional judgment, continued operations without structural assessment and repair posed an unacceptable risk to the men working the shaft. He asked Caldwell to suspend operations immediately. He received no reply. 40 days later, 11 men died. Jack sat with that sequence of information for a long time. The morning light had moved across the table and was now at an angle that caught the edge of the documents and made them look briefly like something architectural. Structural drawings, load diagrams, the language of his own profession, deployed in a context where it had meant the difference between men who went home and men who did not. Walter had warned them. He had put it in writing, with his professional credentials behind it. He had told Harrison Caldwell that men were going to die, and Caldwell had chosen to continue, and men had died. And then the official record had described their deaths as unforeseeable. Walter had been the person who could prove they were foreseeable, the only engineering professional outside the Caldwell organization who had examined the surface evidence and reached a documented conclusion and put his name to it in writing. That was why the cabin had been sealed, not to protect mineral resources, to bury Walter Merritt, to prevent him from becoming the witness whose letter would transform 11 mining deaths from a tragic accident into something that had a different name in a court of law. Jack stood up and walked to the window and looked through the gap in the boards at the valley below. The Caldwell Energy Facility, 3rd generation now, running full production on land that Walter Merritt had refused to surrender, on ground where 11 men had died because a warning in writing was overruled by 2 words on a forgery of a signature that a man had declined to give. "There are names," he said quietly. "The 11 men." "Yes," Vera said. "I want them." She reached into the satchel and placed a single page on the table. 11 names in alphabetical order, with ages and home communities, and the names of surviving family members as of the date of the accident. Some of those families would still have people alive who remembered. some would not. Jack would need to find out. One name was near the top of the list. Thomas Merritt, 34 years old, from Hillsborough, survived by wife and 2 children. Thomas Merritt, Walter's brother, Jack's great-uncle, a man whose existence he had never been told of, whose death had been kept from the family, along with everything else that made Walter's story legible. Jack stood at the window with the list in his hand and felt the specific gravity of a name that has been erased and is now being read for the first time. He folded the list carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, the inside pocket close to his chest. His phone rang. "Danny." "Dad?" The voice was careful, doing what it always did, managing the distance between them with a politeness that had once been warmth and had calcified into something more formal over the years. "I got your text. What's going on?" Jack looked at the documents on the table. He thought about how to explain this and understood there was no version that would sound like anything other than what it was. "I need you to come to Pocahontas County," he said. "I need a few days. I will tell you everything when you get here." A pause. The pause of a 26-year-old calculating the cost of his father's requests against the unpredictable return. "Dad, I have work." "I know you do. Take personal days. Tell them it is a family emergency." He paused. "It is a family emergency." Another silence, longer. "How serious is this?" Jack looked at the blank signature line on the Caldwell contract. He looked at Thomas Merritt's name, folded in his inside pocket. He looked at the window boards and the valley beyond them and the lights of an operation that had been running on a forged name and buried evidence for 70 years. "It is the most serious thing I have ever asked you to do," he said, "and I have not asked you for much." The line was quiet. Then Danny said he would leave in the morning. Jack stood holding the phone after the call ended. He felt the weight of having asked. He had not asked Danny for anything in 4 years, not because there had been nothing to ask, but because he had decided somewhere along the way that maintaining the distance was a form of not imposing. He understood now that it had also been a form of not trusting, which was a different kind of imposition, dressed in different clothes. He turned back to Vera. "Tell me about Preston Caldwell," he said. Vera organized her thoughts the way an attorney organizes a case, starting with structure before detail. Preston Caldwell III, 65 years old, had taken control of the company from his father in 2001 and had spent the subsequent 23 years expanding it in ways that were simultaneously more sophisticated and more cautious than his grandfather's generation had operated. Harrison Caldwell had functioned in an era when certain things were simply done, and the institutional framework to challenge them barely existed. Preston operated in an era of environmental disclosure requirements and investigative journalism and public company accountability, and he had built systems for managing all of it. The Blackwater Valley operation was the oldest asset in the portfolio, and in certain ways, the most important one, not because of its current coal output, which was declining along with the broader industry, but because of what lay beneath the surface layers that had been mined across 70 years. Walter's 1947 geological survey had identified the primary seam and estimated its volume. What Walter could not have known, because the technology did not exist in 1947 to see it, was what lay deeper. Vera placed one more document on the table, a geological assessment commissioned by Caldwell Energy in 2019, marked highly confidential. Below the primary coal seam, at a depth of 1,200 feet across much of the Blackwater Valley property, was a deposit of rare earth elements in concentrations the assessment described as commercially significant, the kind of deposit that had become strategically important in the context of technology manufacturing and battery supply chains, the kind of resource that federal agencies now tracked and that international competition had made genuinely valuable. The land Walter Merritt had refused to surrender was not just coal country anymore. It had become something worth considerably more than coal. In an era where that value was increasing every year and attracting attention from places Pocahontas County had never previously been relevant to. "Does Preston know you have this?" Jack asked. "Preston knows I left the company with documents I should not have taken. He does not know specifically which ones. He has been careful about finding out, because finding out would require him to acknowledge in a legal context that the documents exist." She paused. "That caution has limits. I have been watching it approach those limits for 2 years. What changed 2 years ago? The rare earth deposit became relevant to a federal supply chain initiative. Caldwell Energy was approached about a public-private development partnership with the Department of Energy. That kind of partnership requires full disclosure of property title history going back to original acquisition." She looked at him. "Which means they need the Merritt title question resolved before any such partnership can proceed. Which is why they filed to renew the closure order. Which is why Gerald Foss came looking for you when he did." The geometry of it was becoming clear to Jack. Not the personal story, not the injustice to Walter and to 11 dead men, but the structural logic underneath it. Money large enough to attract federal attention required a foundation that could withstand federal scrutiny. The forgery that had functioned perfectly in Pocahontas County in 1952 was inadequate to the scale of what the property had become. They needed the Merritt title issue resolved cleanly before they could proceed, and resolved cleanly meant either buying Jack's silence or ensuring he never found what Walter had left in that cabin. "They need my signature," Jack said, "or they need you to not exist legally," Vera said, "which they preferred to arrange by keeping the closure order active long enough to establish uncontested possession. You broke the seal ahead of their renewal petition. You have the original documents. That changes the calculation significantly." She looked at him. "It also means that what happens next needs to happen quickly before they find another way to manage it." Outside, from somewhere down the gravel track, came the sound of a vehicle idling. Not approaching, just present. The same quality of reminder as the morning. Jack listened to it for a moment without moving toward the window. "How solid is your documentation?" he asked. 30 years of a careful person keeping records of things that mattered," Vera said. "It is as solid as documentation gets without a court order compelling production." "And your professional exposure, taking those documents?" "I retained copies pursuant to my obligations under the West Virginia Rules of Professional Conduct, which require attorneys to maintain records necessary to protect the interests of those affected by their work." A pause. "The question of whose interests I was protecting is one I am prepared to answer in any forum that chooses to ask it." Jack nodded slowly. He thought about the shape of what they had assembled between them on this table in a cabin in the mountains. Walter's original documents, Vera's 30 years of internal records, and the still-living witness whose existence neither of them had fully confirmed. The 3 legs of something that, if all 3 held, would be very difficult to knock over. "Who else knows you are here?" he asked. "No one. I drove my daughter's car. I paid cash for gas." She said it with the matter-of-fact quality of a person who had been thinking about operational security for a long time and had learned from experts without meaning to. "I have lived carefully for several years." Jack looked at her steadily. He thought about what 30 years of that required. Sitting in the meetings, drafting the filings, maintaining the professional surface, while the other record accumulated in a separate place. He had spent 14 months in a trailer park, keeping himself functional when the external reasons to do so had essentially disappeared. The discipline was different in scale. not in kind. "Carol Merritt," he said. "I need to find her." Vera was quiet in a different way than her previous pauses. The quiet of a person deciding whether to release the last piece of something they have been holding. "Walter was afraid for her in his final journal entry," Jack said. "Not afraid she was already gone. Afraid of what might happen to her. There is a difference." He looked at the composition notebooks on the shelf. "And a woman who understood the land the way Walter described does not simply disappear in a car accident in 1955. Not while everything Walter knew was still unresolved." Vera looked at him with an expression he could not fully read. "There is a care facility in Hardy County," she said finally, "on the Virginia line. Small, private, has operated continuously since the early 1950s. She paused. "I have known about it for 11 years. I was never certain enough to act on the knowledge alone. I did not have what you have." "Which is what?" Jack asked. "A reason she would trust someone enough to talk," Vera said. "You are Walter's grandson. You carry his face in the way that certain things pass through blood without asking permission. And you have his journals. The journals are something she could verify." The vehicle on the gravel track had gone silent at some point while they were talking. The silence it left had the particular shape of something that had been there and had noted what it needed to note and had withdrawn to report. Jack looked at the documents on the table and at the 11 names in his jacket pocket and at Vera, who had spent 30 years in the machine specifically to be useful at this moment. He thought about Danny driving south through the night, coming towards something he did not yet understand, because his father had said it mattered. That was a form of trust he had not earned and had been given anyway. He was not going to waste any of it. He thought about what Vera had described, 30 years of keeping a parallel record inside the company that had built itself on Walter's stolen land. The patience that required was not passive patience. It was the patience of someone who had made a strategic decision early and had never deviated from it, who had sat through board meetings and contract negotiations and annual reports and the ordinary performance of corporate success, and had kept the other account running in silence underneath all of it. Jack understood that kind of long patience in a way he might not have 4 years ago. The 14 months in the trailer park had not been wasted. They had been the period during which he stripped away everything that was not structural, everything that was circumstantial or imposed from outside, and found out what remained when none of that was present anymore. What remained was small and quiet, and harder than he expected. It was not the ambition, or the professional pride, or the satisfaction of building something and being known for it. It was something more durable than all of those, the thing that had been there before any of those other things had accumulated around it. He did not have a word for it. Engineers often did not have words for the most fundamental things. They had calculations. Vera had been doing her own calculation for 30 years, a calculation that required her to be exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she appeared to be doing, while the real work accumulated in a separate register. Jack did not know how she had sustained it. He suspected the answer was simple and difficult simultaneously, the way the answers to the most important questions usually were. She had sustained it because the alternative was to let everything Walter had tried to protect disappear completely, and that was not something she was able to do. He thought about Gerald Foss in the same way, a man who had carried Walter's secret for 40 years, who had spent those decades finding the right heir and watching the world fail to produce one, until a man living in a trailer park answered a phone call at 8:47 in the evening and agreed to meet. Gerald had kept his own record. His record was a manila envelope and a dying man's determination to deliver it before the window closed. 3 people had kept Walter's truth alive long enough to be useful, and none of them had known the others were doing it in the same way, toward the same end, across the same 70 years. Jack found that remarkable, not in an abstract way, in the specific way of an engineer who understands that certain structures distribute their load across multiple points precisely because any single point of failure would bring the whole thing down. Walter had not planned this network. It had formed around his act of refusal, the way certain geological features form around a hard core of resistant material, building up over time into something that can withstand pressure that would have destroyed any single element. Danny was part of it now, not because he had known about any of this, because he had answered the phone and driven through the night and said, "Tell me what you need," which was the thing you said when the calculation you were running was not about yourself. "We leave at first light," he said, "for Hardy County." Vera nodded once. She began organizing the documents back into the satchel with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for a long time and was now simply executing. Jack picked up the 1946 notebook and kept reading, because understanding the full structure of a problem before you act on it was not caution. It was engineering. And Walter had left him this record of how the problem had developed from its origin, which meant Walter had understood that whoever came after him would need not just the evidence, but the context, the story behind the evidence, the human architecture that explained why the evidence existed and what it had cost to preserve it. Outside, the afternoon valley light was going long and golden. Far below, on the access road of the Caldwell facility, shift-change vehicles were moving in their ordinary pattern, the machinery of a 70-year enterprise operating on the assumption that what was buried stayed buried. In 24 hours, that assumption was going to encounter something it had not been designed to withstand. Jack Merritt read until the light failed. In the chair his grandfather had built, in the cabin his grandfather had sealed, with the evidence his grandfather had prepared for exactly this purpose, laid out in a pattern on the table before him. He thought about Miles Pruitt. The sheriff had come with a warning, dressed in courtesy, and he had read Jack's documentation with the attention of a man who was genuinely reading it, not performing a check on behalf of whoever had sent him. There was a calculation happening behind Pruitt's neutral face that Jack had not been able to read fully. 22 years in a county where one company was the largest employer and had the deepest institutional relationships was a long time to maintain a private account of what you had seen and not acted on. The morning visit had been the visit of a man delivering a message from above. Whether Pruitt had also been taking notes for himself was something Jack could not yet determine. But the way he had read the authorization documents, with the specific attention of a man who was memorizing rather than simply checking, suggested that Miles Pruitt was running his own calculation. What he would do with it, and when, remained to be seen. Jack set the notebook down and looked at the map on the wall and at the valley below with its operational lights coming on in the dusk, and at the documents that represented 3 generations of one family's refusal to let a wrong become permanent. The drive to Hardy County was 212 miles, most of it on roads that climbed and descended without apology through the dark heart of the Appalachians. Jack drove Vera's daughter's car because Vera said her eyes were not reliable on mountain roads after dark, and it was already evening when they left the cabin and would be full night before they arrived. Danny stayed with the original documents, photographing every page with his phone and uploading copies to 3 separate cloud accounts and 1 external drive he had brought from Pittsburgh, a task Jack had not asked him to perform, but that Danny had begun without being told. The instinct of a man trained to understand that primary records need redundant backups. Vera talked while Jack drove, and what she told him about Carol Merritt assembled itself in his understanding the way a structure assembles itself when you add the load-bearing members in sequence, each piece making the previous ones more stable and more significant. Carol had not died in a car accident in 1955. She had been in a serious accident on Route 92 in Pocahontas County in the spring of that year. She had survived with significant injuries. During her recovery period, a man from the county social services office had visited and arranged for her long-term placement in a care facility in Hardy County. The arrangement had been framed as a welfare measure for a woman with ongoing medical needs and no immediate family support, Walter having been effectively removed from the picture by that point. What the framing did not disclose was that the financial trust paying for Carol's placement and her ongoing care had been established by a subsidiary of Caldwell Mining. Vera had found the trust documentation in the final years of her time at the firm, buried inside a corporate restructuring file from 1957. The trust had been funded at its establishment and then maintained through quarterly transfers for 70 years. An invisible line item in a large organization's accounting that would mean nothing to anyone who did not know what to look for. They had not killed Carol. It would have been too visible after the attention the cabin ceiling had already drawn. They had done something that in certain respects required more sustained effort than a simpler solution. They had made her disappear into care, and they had paid for her disappearance, and they had maintained that payment for 7 decades, and they had counted on the combination of time and institutional distance to make her irrelevant before anyone came looking. Jack drove and listened and said very little, because there was nothing to say that the information itself had not already said more clearly. The facility was a single-story building on 20 acres of farmland near the Virginia line, the kind of place that presented itself as a rural retirement community with specialized care resources and that had, from the look of the grounds in the headlights as they turned in, been well maintained and well funded across its entire operational life. The kind of place that cost significant money and did not advertise. The kind of place that had been taking care of Carol Merritt since 1955, with money that came from the people who had put her there. The woman at the reception desk said visiting hours had ended at 7. Vera placed a business card on the counter. It was her old card from the firm, the one that carried the Caldwell name in the lower right corner. She did not explain why she was using it. The woman behind the counter looked at the card and looked at Vera and made a phone call. 14 minutes later, a staff member appeared and led them down a hallway. Jack understood the card. Vera had spent 30 years building relationships that included people who understood that when Caldwell presented itself at a door, the door opened. She was using the last remaining utility of that association for a purpose that would have been incomprehensible to the people who had originally created it. The room at the end of the hall was small and well kept. A window looked out on the dark farmland, the suggestion of a field visible in the ambient light from the parking area. In the chair beside the window, wrapped in a quilt of blue and green squares, sat a woman who was 88 years old and carried herself with the posture of someone who had decided very early in life that posture was a form of dignity that could not be taken from her, and had maintained it across 7 decades of circumstances that had taken nearly everything else. She looked at Jack when he came through the door. A long look, the specific assessment of a person who is accustomed to strangers appearing and has developed precise methods for determining which kind of stranger this one is. "You have Walter's hands," she said. Her voice was clear and carried authority, the voice of a woman who had not spoken to many people in many years, but had not allowed her voice to weaken from disuse. Jack sat in the chair across from her. "I am his grandson, Jack Merritt." Carol looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at Vera, and her expression became something more layered, not hostile, but containing a specific recognition that was not warm. The expression of a person who knows exactly who she is looking at and what that association means. "You worked for them," Carol said to Vera. "I did," Vera said. "For 30 years, I kept records of everything they did, so that one day I could sit in exactly this room." Carol was quiet. She looked back at Jack. "Walter always said the truth would wait," she said. "He said it does not require protection forever. It only requires one person willing to say it in the right room at the right time." "I have his journals," Jack said. "I found them in the cabin. I found everything he left in the fireplace. The deeds, the survey records, the contract with the signature line blank." He paused. "I know about the number 3 shaft. I know about the letter he sent to Harrison Caldwell. I know about Thomas." Carol's expression moved at the name Thomas. Something crossed it that was very old and had not lost any of its weight across the years. "Thomas was the one Walter could not save," she said quietly. "He warned them. He put it in writing, with his credentials behind it. And they let Thomas and 10 other men go underground anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "Walter spent the rest of his life with that. Not just the land, not just the fraud, the 11 men. That was the weight he carried." "I know," Jack said. "He wrote it in his last entry. The land is not the point. It was never about the land. 11 men." Carol reached under the quilt. She withdrew a small tin box, the kind that had once held something ordinary and had been repurposed long ago for something that needed to be close and durable and small enough to keep hidden. She held it on her lap for a moment. "He gave this to me the night before they sealed the cabin," she said. "He said, 'Keep this where only you know.' He said if anything happened to him, this was the piece that mattered most, the one that could not be explained away." She opened the box and removed a folded sheet of paper, creased along its folds to near transparency at the edges from decades of careful handling. She held it out to Jack. He unfolded it with the care of a man handling something that has been held together by intention alone across 71 years. It was Walter's letter to Harrison Caldwell, February 3rd, 1953. Walter's handwriting, the same precise cursive from the journals. Every technical detail Jack had read in Vera's copy of the internal documentation was here in Walter's own words. The surface subsidence indicators, the structural assessment, the professional judgment that continued operations posed unacceptable risk. And below Walter's signature, in a different hand, ink slightly different in shade, the notation of a man confirming he had received what he had received. Received and reviewed. H.C., February 5th, 1953. Harrison Caldwell had signed Walter's warning. He had put his initials and the date on the letter that proved he had known, that he had read it, that continue operations had been his own 2-word response to a mine engineer telling him people were going to die. Jack held the letter in both hands and looked at it for a long time. This was the piece. Not the land deeds, not the survey records, not even the forged contract. This was the piece that transformed the story from a property dispute into something that had a different category of weight. An engineer's warning, professionally signed. A powerful man's confirmation that the warning had been received. 40 days, 11 men. "I have kept it for 71 years, Carol said. Her voice was steady and very tired. "I am ready to stop keeping it." Jack folded the letter with the same care with which Carol had unfolded it across all those years and placed it in his jacket pocket beside the list of 11 names. He felt the weight of them together as something specific and structural. He looked at Carol. "I am going to use all of it," he said. "Everything Walter left, everything Vera documented, everything you have preserved. I am going to put it in front of the people who need to see it, in rooms where it costs something to say it." Carol looked at him for a moment. "Walter would say that is all it ever required," she said. "The truth does not need a hero. It needs a room." Jack sat with her for another 20 minutes. He told her what he had found in the cabin. He told her about the hidden cavity in the fireplace, and the oilcloth bundle, and the unsigned contract. He told her about Danny driving through the night from Pittsburgh, and about Vera's 30 years of record-keeping. He told her what he intended to do in the morning. Carol listened without interrupting, with the patient attention of a woman who has been waiting for a specific report for a very long time and is now receiving it. When he stood to leave, she reached out and touched his hand briefly. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They drove back through the West Virginia night in the silence of two people who have just witnessed something that does not require commentary. The mountains on either side of the road were invisible in the dark. Their presence felt rather than seen, the particular weight of old geography pressing against the sky. Jack drove steadily, and Vera held the satchel on her lap with both hands, and neither of them spoke for a long time. They reached the cabin at close to midnight. Danny had left a light on inside, visible through the gaps in the window boards as they came up the rise. Jack parked, and they went in. Danny was at the table, with his laptop open and the documents arranged in careful sequence across the surface. He had photographed everything and created the backups as instructed, but he had also spent the evening doing something Jack had not asked him to do, the work of someone who had arrived without a full picture and had spent the available hours building one. Danny had a degree in financial analysis and had spent 4 years working for a Pittsburgh firm that specialized in corporate due diligence. Jack had known this in the abstract way that fathers know facts about their adult children's careers without fully understanding what those careers contain. He understood it concretely now, watching his son walk him through what he had found in Caldwell Energy's publicly available filings with the quiet efficiency of someone applying professional skill to a problem that was personal in a way no professional problem had ever been before. The Blackwater Valley property had been carried on the company's books under a series of subsidiary names across the decades. The mineral rights had been separated from the surface rights in 1954, 1 year after the 11 men died, and that separation had been accomplished through a corporate restructuring that generated a very thin paper trail relative to the value of what was being moved. In Danny's professional experience, a thin paper trail around a transfer of significant value was either very sloppy accounting or very careful accounting, and when the company doing it was run by intelligent people, it was the second one. Jack sat at the table and looked at his son's work, alongside Walter's documents and Vera's files and Carol's letter, and understood that what he was looking at was no longer a story. Stories could be dismissed. What he had was a structure, load-bearing and interconnected, the kind of evidentiary architecture that does not collapse when you remove one element, because the remaining elements continue to hold the weight. He told Danny about Carol, about the tin box and the letter, and what was written at the bottom of it in Harrison Caldwell's own hand. Danny listened without interrupting, and when Jack finished, Danny looked at the list of 11 names on the table and was quiet for a moment. Thomas Merritt was his great-uncle, Danny said. Yes. Danny looked at the list for a long moment with the expression of someone allowing information to move from the category of fact into the category of meaning. Then he said one word. Okay. The way he said it carried the weight of several sentences. It meant he understood and had accepted the understanding and was not going to put it down. They worked until 2 in the morning. Jack and Vera organized the documents into presentation sequence, the narrative logic of the case laid out in paper and ink on the table. Danny built a financial timeline on his laptop, tracking the mineral rights movement through Caldwell's corporate structure decade by decade, each transfer annotated with the corresponding public record and, where Vera's files provided it, the internal documentation that explained what the public record had been designed to conceal. At 2, Jack told them both to sleep. He took the first watch himself, sitting in Walter's chair with the documents in his bag at his feet. He thought about the plan he needed to build. He was not a lawyer or a journalist or a government official. He was a 58-year-old engineer with no current professional standing, recently living in a trailer park, recently in possession of evidence that a publicly listed energy company had built its core asset on fraud and had allowed 11 men to die to protect its ability to continue that fraud. The question was not whether the evidence was sufficient. It was. The question was where to take it, in what order, to ensure it could not be quietly absorbed and neutralized by people who had been managing that kind of absorption for 70 years. The plan he constructed in Walter's chair between 2 and 5 in the morning was an engineer's plan. Systematic, sequenced, redundant, multiple paths to the same outcome so that blocking one did not stop the others. At 5, he woke Vera and explained it. She listened with her eyes half closed and then fully open, and then with the expression of someone applying 30 years of legal expertise to what she was hearing. She changed 3 things: the sequence of federal notification, the specific statute under which the geological fraud claim would be filed, and the press channel. Her changes were improvements. Jack incorporated them without discussion, because incorporating improvements without discussion was how you built things that held. At 7, Danny woke on his own. Jack gave him 2 tasks: drive to Charleston, find a notary, execute affidavits for Jack and for Vera and for Carol Merritt, whose signed statement about the events of 1952 and 1953 and the letter she had preserved was the human core of the case. Then deliver the full document package to the West Virginia Attorney General's office, the Regional Department of Interior office, and the Charleston Bureau of the Associated Press, all 3 before noon, in that order. Danny wrote down the addresses without being asked. He had looked them up the previous evening. "If anyone approaches you," Jack said, "you keep moving. You call me immediately." Danny looked at him. "Dad, I know how to do this." Jack looked at his son across the table with Walter's documents between them and understood with the specific clarity of a man who has been too tired for too long to maintain his usual defenses that Danny did know how to do this, had known for years, had been doing things Jack did not know about for a long time in a life that Jack had not been close enough to observe. The distance between them had not only cost Jack a relationship, it had cost him knowledge of who his son actually was. "I know you do," Jack said. Danny left at 7:30. Jack watched the Civic go down the gravel track and disappear into the tree line and stood for a moment in the morning air before going back inside. He sat at the table and wrote a letter. Not to Preston Caldwell, not to a government agency. A letter to the families of 11 men, on a page from the blank end of Walter's 1952 composition notebook, the pages Walter had never had the opportunity to fill. He wrote that their fathers and grandfathers had died in a shaft that a mine engineer had warned in writing was going to fail. He wrote that the warning had been received and acknowledged and overruled by the man responsible for the decision. He wrote that the man who had sent the warning had paid for it with his land and his freedom and his family's history, and that the cost had been carried for 3 generations by people who did not know why they were carrying it. He wrote that this was going to be said now, in the rooms where it needed to be said, because Walter Merritt had left the evidence to make it possible. He signed it and placed it in his jacket pocket. At 9 o'clock, he drove to Charleston with Vera in the passenger seat and the bag of documents in the back. The Caldwell Energy Building was exactly as Vera had described it. A tower of glass and limestone in the financial district that announced its own permanence in the way buildings do when the people inside them have spent decades being certain of it. The name on the building caught the morning light and held it. Jack walked through the lobby without slowing down. They were expected. Danny's deliveries to the Attorney General and the Department of Interior had preceded them. The Associated Press package would have arrived within the last hour. Preston Caldwell III had been receiving calls since before 8 in the morning and had made his own calls in response and had arrived at the conference room on the 31st floor with 2 lawyers beside him and a third positioned against the wall, and the specific expression of a man who has been managing a long-standing problem and has just discovered that the problem has acquired new dimensions. Jack sat across from Preston Caldwell, and Vera sat beside Jack, and there was no one else on their side of the table, which was an asymmetry Jack had intended. 3 lawyers against 2 people signaled that the lawyers were operating from fear and afraid people made mistakes. "We understand you believe you have a claim," one of the lawyers began. Jack looked at him briefly and returned his attention to Preston. "I am going to talk to you," he said, "not to your lawyers." The lawyer started again. Preston raised one hand, and the lawyer stopped. "My grandfather built this company," Preston said. His voice was measured. He was managing something. "Your grandfather built it on my grandfather's land," Jack said. "With my grandfather's signature forged on a document my grandfather refused to sign, on ground where 11 men died after my grandfather warned in writing that they would die. He let that sit for 1 beat. I have the original unsigned contract. I have the filed version with the forged signature. I have Walter Merritt's geological survey establishing his professional standing and the property value. I have his letter to Harrison Caldwell, dated February 3rd, 1953, warning about the structural failure in the number 3 shaft. I have Harrison Caldwell's own notation on that letter, his initials and the date February 5th, 1953, establishing that the warning was received 40 days before 11 men died. I have 30 years of your company's internal documentation establishing the pattern of asset concealment through subsidiary restructurings. I have a forensic financial analysis of the mineral rights transfer chain, and I have a living witness who has preserved corroborating evidence for 71 years in a facility your predecessor's money paid to maintain. The room held a silence that had actual weight. As of this morning, Jack continued, copies of the complete record are with the West Virginia Attorney General, the regional office of the Department of the Interior, and the Associated Press. The AP will publish what they have, regardless of what is decided in this room. The government agencies will investigate regardless. What is decided in this room determines what kind of company Caldwell Energy is on the other side of those processes. Preston looked at the documents Jack had placed on the table, Vera's carefully organized copies in the sequence they had assembled the night before. He looked at his lawyers with an expression that communicated something that made the lead lawyer look away. Then he looked back at Jack, and the silence lasted long enough to have its own structure. Walter's journals had been full of the patience of a man who understood how to wait, who had built his professional life around the principle that you do not force a conclusion before the structure is ready to hold it. Jack had inherited that without knowing. He used it now. "What do you want?" Preston said. The question of a man who has moved past denial and reached the only ground where a real negotiation can happen. Jack told him. Full legal recognition of Walter Merritt's original ownership of the 1,400-acre Blackwater Valley property and acknowledgement that the recorded mineral rights transfer was obtained through document fraud. A structured partnership establishing Jack Merritt as a co-developer of the property, including the rare earth deposit, with terms to be negotiated by independent counsel, a named memorial on the Blackwater Valley site honoring the 11 men who died in the number 3 shaft collapse on March 14, 1953, with Thomas Merritt's name included, and the release of Carol Merritt from the care arrangement that Caldwell Money had sustained, with an independent settlement providing for her care through the remainder of her life. He did not ask for a criminal referral. That was not his to give or withhold. The Attorney General's office would determine what the evidence required. He did not ask for a public apology. Words cost nothing, and he was not interested in what cost nothing. Preston sat with the terms. His lawyers were writing. One passed a note across the table. Preston read it and set it aside. The rare earth partnership will require independent valuation, Preston said. We expect it will, Vera said. It was the first time she had spoken in the room. Her voice had the authority of someone who had spent 30 years inside this company and was now speaking from outside it, which was a different kind of knowledge than anything title or salary could confer. The memorial is not a legal matter, Preston said. No, Jack said. It is a human one, which is why I am asking you directly rather than through a filing. Preston looked at him with a different quality of attention than he had given him at the start of the meeting. Something in it that Jack did not try to categorize. The expression of a man who has inherited something that has always had a question at its foundation and has now arrived at the moment when the question cannot be deferred. My grandfather made decisions I cannot defend, Preston said quietly. I know, Jack said. I am not asking you to defend them. I am asking you to correct what can still be corrected. The meeting lasted 4 hours. The civil rights attorney, Vera, had reached the previous evening, arrived at 11, and took the technical negotiation over. Jack sat at the table and said very little for the remaining hours. The documents were speaking, and they spoke with a precision that exceeded anything he could add. At 2:30 in the afternoon, a framework agreement was initialed, not final, not binding in all provisions, but containing the core acknowledgements, the fraud, the property recognition, the partnership structure, the memorial, Carol Merritt's freedom. The 60-day timeline for the binding agreement was written in. The legal machinery that would produce it was set in motion. Jack walked out of the Caldwell Energy Building at 3 in the afternoon, with Vera beside him and the bag on his shoulder, and the Charleston sun, low and bright, over the Kanawha River. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the river for a moment. It was moving the way it always moved, carrying the mountain water south with the complete indifference of something that has been here longer than any of the things built on its banks and will be here after all of them are gone. He called Danny. It's done, he said. Or it started. Come back to the cabin. The AG's office asked me questions, Danny said. I answered them. Good. A pause. Dad. The word had a different quality than it had carried for a long time. Are you okay? Jack thought about the question honestly. He was standing on a sidewalk in Charleston with a bag of documents that had been sealed in a fireplace for 70 years, having just spent 4 hours in a conference room with the third-generation heir of the man who had tried to erase his grandfather, having signed a framework that would take 60 days and then more time beyond that to fully implement, with an AP story going out on the wire and a government investigation just beginning, and an 88-year-old woman in Hardy County who was going to wake up tomorrow free of the arrangement that had contained her since 1955. "I'm okay," he said. "Drive safe." He drove back to Pocahontas County alone. On the mountain roads, he now knew differently than he had known them 5 days ago. The mountains were the same mountains. He understood them differently because he understood now what had happened in them, and who had built a cabin on a rise above one of their valleys to see the geometry of what he was up against, and what that man had left behind, and what it had taken to find it. He arrived at the cabin as the evening was settling. Danny was already there, sitting on the front step with a coffee cup, looking down at the valley. He looked up when Jack parked, and they looked at each other across the clearing. Jack sat down beside him on the step. They sat without speaking for a while, and the silence between them was different from the silence that had characterized their interactions for the past decade. That silence had been the silence of managed distance. This one was the silence of two people who had been through something together and were allowing it to settle. Below the ridge, the Blackwater Valley was going into its evening colors. The Caldwell Energy Facility was visible with its lights coming on for the night shift. It was still running. It would keep running for a while. These things did not change in a day, but the ground beneath it had changed. Not physically, legally, historically, and in the record that would be written from this point forward. The forgery at the foundation of everything built in that valley was now a documented fact in 3 government offices and a wire service, and the man who had refused to give his name to it was going to get back something of what that refusal had cost. And the 11 men who had gone into the ground on March 14th, 1953, were going to have their names on a wall where people could read them. "Tell me about him," Danny said. Jack looked at his son. "Walter?" "Yeah." Jack thought about the journals and the composition notebooks and the map on the wall and the cavity behind the fireplace stone and the child's drawing still folded on the nightstand in the sleeping area. He thought about the handwriting, precise and dense, the penmanship of a man who understood that what you put on paper either means something or it means nothing, and who had chosen meaning every time. He was an engineer, Jack said. He mapped the ground under his own feet with the same rigor he would have brought to any professional project. He found something valuable, and someone tried to take it from him with paperwork, and he refused. He understood that the record of a refusal matters as much as the refusal itself, so he documented everything. He paused. When they came for him anyway, he hid the record and sealed the door and trusted that the structure he had built would hold until the right person came to use it. Danny looked down at the valley. "He picked you. He picked whoever was in the right position," Jack said. He couldn't have known who that would be. He knew what the position looked like. A man who had nothing left to protect. Danny was quiet for a moment. "Is that how you felt when you got the call?" Jack considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I felt like a man who had been told he had something to do," he said. "That is a different feeling from having nothing to protect. It turns out they are related." They sat on the step until the light was entirely gone, and the valley was sound rather than sight. The creek below the ridge, and the machinery in the distance, and the wind moving through the timber on the high ground. The stars came out the way they come out in places far from city light, arriving all at once when the darkness reaches the depth where they become visible, the full sky populated in a moment. Miles Pruitt called at 9:47 in the evening. Jack had not expected to hear from him. The number appeared on his phone with the Pocahontas County prefix, and he answered it after one ring. Pruitt's voice had the same neutral quality it had carried in the morning 2 days earlier, But underneath the neutrality was something that had not been there before, a decision that had been made. "I heard about what happened today in Charleston," Pruitt said. "Word moves fast in this county when it concerns Caldwell." A pause. "I want you to know that I contacted the AG's office this afternoon independently. I provided a statement about the events of the past 2 days and my understanding of the parties involved." Jack said nothing. He waited. "I have been sheriff here for 22 years, Pruitt said. "There are things I have known about and not acted on. Some of those things are in that statement." Another pause. "I do not know yet what that means for my position. That is not why I am calling." "Why are you calling?" Jack asked. "Because your grandfather warned them," Pruitt said, "and they did not listen. And I have spent 22 years in this county, and I know which warning that is." A pause. "The kind of warning that gets buried because the people who need to hear it have already decided what to do regardless. I know what that costs." His voice was quiet. "I am trying to be the person who does not cost that to someone else." The line was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate the call," Jack said. "I do not know if I deserve appreciation," Pruitt said, "but I wanted you to know." The call ended. Jack sat in the dark with the phone in his hand and thought about 22 years in a county and a private account of what you had seen and not acted on, and the specific courage required to settle that account in a direction that was correct rather than merely convenient. He went inside and sat at Walter's table for a while, with the lantern on, looking at the documents in their final organized sequence. Tomorrow they would go to lawyers and begin their formal life in legal proceedings. The originals would leave this table, leave this cabin, enter the institutional processes that would determine what happened next and on what timeline. He was all right with that. They had done what Walter had put them there to do. He picked up the journal and turned to the last entry, October 19th, 1952, and read it one final time. They came back this evening, 2 of them this time, and the man from the county office who has been in Caldwell's pocket since before the war. "I have made arrangements. I have put everything where it needs to be found by the right person at the right time. If the name Walter Merritt means anything after I am gone, it will be because someone found what I left here and had the stomach and the patience to use it properly. I do not need vindication. The land is not the point. It was never about the land. 11 men. That is the point. Someone has to say their names out loud in a room where it costs something to say them." Jack closed the journal carefully and held it in both hands for a moment. Then he placed it on the shelf in its sequence beside the composition notebooks. 1946 through 1952, the record of a man who had known what he was doing and had done it completely, including the part where he trusted the future to produce someone who would finish it. In the blank pages at the back of the 1952 notebook, Jack wrote the 11 names, all of them, slowly and completely in his own hand, in a notebook that had been waiting for those pages to be used since Walter had sealed the door. Thomas Merritt first, then the other 10, each name given the space it deserved. He set the notebook back on the shelf and turned down the lantern and sat in the dark of the cabin on the rise above the Blackwater Valley. He had arrived as a man with $3,200 in an envelope and a truck with a scratch on the passenger door that he had sold because there was nothing else left to sell. He was leaving as the documented heir to 1,400 acres of mountain land above a rare earth deposit, with a framework agreement, a government investigation, a memorial to be built, and an old woman in Hardy County who was going to wake up tomorrow free. He had also found something that was not on any of those lists. He had found his grandfather, who had been waiting in a cabin on a rise for exactly this, a man with nothing left to protect who turned out to be exactly the man the evidence needed. And in finding his grandfather, he had found his son, or allowed his son to find him, which was perhaps more accurate to what had actually happened. The work was not finished. It would take months or years to fully resolve. The partnership would require negotiation and valuation. The memorial would require design and construction and a ceremony to which 11 families would need to be invited and found. The government investigation would proceed at its own pace and produce whatever it produced. But the ground had been broken, in the engineering sense and in the other sense. Walter Merritt had been an engineer. He had mapped the ground beneath his own feet with professional rigor and with love, and he had refused to give his name to something wrong, and he had paid for that refusal with everything he could name. And he had prepared the record and sealed the door and trusted the future. And the future had sent Jack, and Jack had sent Danny, and Vera had spent 30 years in the machine keeping her own record, and Carol had kept a tin box under a quilt for 71 years, and Gerald Foss had carried a manila envelope for 40 years and delivered it on the last available day. None of them had been alone. The truth Walter had preserved had not been preserved by one person. It had been held by a network of people who had each kept their piece of it for as long as they needed to, and had passed it forward when the time came, and together had kept it intact across 70 years until it reached a room where it could be said at the cost of something. The creek ran below the ridge. It had always run. It would keep running after all of this had passed into the settled history of Pocahontas County and the families of 11 men, and the legal record of what Harrison Caldwell had done and what his grandson had acknowledged. It ran the way the truth ran, Jack thought. Not loudly, not heroically, not because anyone was watching. It ran because that was what it did, because the mountain fed it, and the valley carried it, and the river received it, and the whole system moved the way systems move when they are working the way they were built to work. He had found the room. He had said it. The rest was already in motion.